The house on Delaney Avenue stood like a relic from another time, a grand yet decaying structure that once held promise, now overshadowed by broken dreams. The air around it felt heavy, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension, the whispered arguments, the shattered illusions. David Tronis had seen this house as his golden opportunity. To the world, he was a man with a vision, an investor with a keen eye for transformation. He had spent countless hours envisioning its rebirth, a modernized marvel worthy of national television. He had told everyone who would listen that the house would be featured on Zombie House Flipping, a show that turned rundown properties into masterpieces. But beneath the grand ambitions, something darker simmered, a growing obsession, a marriage unraveling at the seams. Shanti Cooper Tronis had once believed in this dream, or at least in the man who had sold it to her. She was intelligent, accomplished, and had built a career based on logic and pragmatism. She had supported David despite the absurd amounts of money he poured into renovations, despite the endless delays, despite his ever-increasing distance from her. But there were limits, and she had reached hers. The fights had become frequent, sharp, and exhausting. She had tried to reason with him, to remind him that a house was just a house, that their lives together should matter more. But David was not listening anymore. He was too far gone, too wrapped up in the illusion he had built, and now she could feel it in her bones. Something had changed. That night the house was silent, yet the silence was anything but comforting. The tension was palpable, like the air before a storm. Shanti had spent the evening in the bedroom, away from David, trying to find solace in the familiarity of her books. But even that felt hollow. She had made a decision, one she knew would change everything. A half-written email glowed on her laptop screen. "I can't keep pretending. If anything happens to me, look at him first." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Was she being paranoid? She shook her head. Number. She knew David. She knew what he was capable of when things didn't go his way. Downstairs, David paced through the unfinished halls of his project, his temple, his obsession. The floorboards creaked beneath his measured steps. His mind raced. Shanti was slipping away from him, and that was unacceptable. She was supposed to support him, to be part of his vision. Why couldn't she see it? Why did she always resist? His hands clenched into fists as he stared at the skeletal remains of what was supposed to be their future. A house stuck in limbo, much like their marriage. Upstairs, Shanti closed her laptop, unaware of the storm brewing below. It would be the last night she ever spent in that house. The morning light filtered through the half-covered windows of the house on Delaney Avenue, casting long, golden streaks across the wooden floors. Outside, the city of Orlando was beginning another day, filled with the familiar hum of cars, distant conversations, and the occasional bark of a restless dog. But inside the house, there was only silence. A silence so thick, so unnatural, that it pressed against the walls like an invisible force. David Tronis stood in the center of the bedroom, his breath shallow, his fingers twitching at his sides. His mind raced, but his body remained unnaturally still. He had been here for hours, pacing, thinking, adjusting the details of his story. It had to make sense. It had to be believable. This was not how things were supposed to go. This was not the way his dream was supposed to unfold. He turned his head slowly, his gaze landing on the motionless figure lying on the bed. Shanti's body was eerily still, her face serene as if she were merely sleeping. But David knew better. He had known the moment it happened, the moment everything had spiraled beyond his control. He had told himself he hadn't meant for it to go this far. But now, staring at her lifeless form, he wasn't sure if that was true. Somewhere deep down, hadn't he always known it would end like this? A knock at the door jolted him back to the present. It was sudden, sharp, too loud in the oppressive quiet. His heart slammed against his ribs. He forced himself to take a slow breath before moving toward the front of the house. He hesitated before opening the door, pulling it just wide enough to reveal his face. On the other side stood a neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, an older woman who had lived on the street for years. Her sharp eyes darted past him, scanning the unfinished living room, the exposed wooden beams, the plastic sheets covering furniture that had yet to be placed. She frowned. I heard some noise last night, she said, her voice laced with curiosity. Is everything all right? David forced a tight-lipped smile, gripping the edge of the door with fingers that felt too stiff. Yeah, just working late. You know how these renovations go. Mrs. Calloway didn't seem convinced. She peered past him again, as if expecting to see Shanti walk down the stairs at any moment. When she didn't, her lips pursed slightly. Haven't seen Shanti this morning. She all right? David swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. She's still asleep, he lied. Had a long day yesterday. Mrs. Calloway studied him for another moment before nodding, though the concern in her eyes didn't fade. All right then, just checking in. David gave a stiff nod and shut the door a little too quickly. He exhaled sharply, pressing his back against the wooden frame. His pulse pounded in his ears. The world outside continued on as if nothing had changed, as if there wasn't a body upstairs. Growing colder with every passing second, he needed to act. He needed to set the scene. He needed a plan. Moving swiftly, he made his way back up the stairs, careful to step over the creaky spot near the third step. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom once more, forcing himself to look at her. There were things he had to do, things he had read about, precautions he needed to take. But before any of that, he had to make the call. With calculated slowness, he reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a fraction of a second before he pressed the numbers. 911, what's your emergency? He took a breath, pulling his voice into something that resembled panic. My wife, she's not breathing. I think she fell. I just found her like this. The dispatcher's voice remained calm, professional. Sir, I need you to stay on the line. Can you tell me if she's responsive? David hesitated, glancing at the bed. The body, the truth. She's not moving, he murmured. Please, you have to send someone. The dispatcher began giving instructions. CPR, checking for a pulse. But David barely heard them. He knew what was coming next. The sirens, the flashing lights, the questions. He just had to be ready. As he stood there, gripping the phone, the house remained as silent as it had been all morning. But now it was a different kind of silence. Not the quiet of an early morning or an unfinished home. No, this was the silence of something irreversible. The silence of a story that had already been written. The silence of a crime waiting to be uncovered. The sirens shattered the eerie silence, their high-pitched wail cutting through the still morning air. Red and blue lights bounced off the peeling paint of the house on Delaney Avenue, flashing in erratic bursts against the unfinished walls inside. The street, usually quiet at this hour, was now alive with movement. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, some stepping onto their porches, whispering among themselves. Inside, David Tronas stood frozen near the front door, his hands clutched into tight fists at his sides. His breathing was shallow, controlled. He had rehearsed this moment in his head a dozen times since making the call. He had gone over every word he had said, ensuring that it sounded just right, concerned but not panicked, distressed but not hysterical. He needed to appear as a grieving husband, blindsided by a terrible accident. A sharp knock at the door made him jolt, though he quickly masked it with a deep breath. He composed his face into what he thought grief should look like, confused, broken, lost. Then he opened the door. Two uniformed officers stood on the porch, their eyes immediately scanning him. The house, the scene unfolding inside. Behind them, an ambulance had pulled up, paramedics already unloading their equipment. Sir, you reported a medical emergency? One of the officers asked, his voice steady but professional. His badge read, Officer Hernandez. David nodded quickly, stepping back to let them in. Yes, my wife. I don't know what happened. I found her this morning, in bed. She's not breathing. I tried waking her up, but his voice trailed off and he let out a shaky breath, as if overwhelmed. The paramedics moved past him without hesitation, heading straight up the stairs. Their heavy boots thudded against the wooden steps, their presence efficient, purposeful. David remained near the doorway, gripping the frame as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Officer Hernandez exchanged a quick glance with his partner, Officer Reed, before speaking again. You said you found her in bed? Yes, David replied, swallowing hard. I think she must have fallen last night, maybe hit her head. I didn't realize. I was downstairs working late, and I slept in the guest room. Reed scribbled something in his notepad. What time did you go to bed? David hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Around midnight, he answered. Hernandez nodded but didn't break eye contact. And you didn't hear anything unusual? David shook his head quickly. Number nothing. But even as the words left his lips, the paramedics' voices echoed from the top of the stairs. No pulse. Rigor has already set in. A chill ran down David's spine. He knew what that meant. She had been dead for hours. The officers exchanged another glance, this one more pointed. Hernandez turned back to David, his expression unreadable. Sir, would you mind stepping outside while the paramedics work? David hesitated. Was this normal? He had seen enough crime shows to know that when someone called 911 for a medical emergency, they were usually allowed to stay close, maybe even asked to help. So why were they already treating him differently? Still, he didn't protest. He nodded, stepping onto the porch. The Florida heat hit him immediately, though it did little to chase away the cold creeping into his chest. He folded his arms, staring blankly at the police cruiser parked in the driveway. The murmurs of the officers and paramedics floated through the open doorway, their voices too low to decipher completely. But then one sentence stood out, clear and sharp. There's no sign of a head injury. David's stomach twisted. Inside the house, paramedic Lisa Grant knelt beside the bed, her experienced eyes scanning the scene. The woman, Shanti Cooper Trones, lay on her back, her limbs unnaturally stiff. The sheets beneath her were smooth, unruffled. The air in the room was still, heavy. Lisa reached out, pressing 2 fingers against the cold skin of Shanti's neck, just below the jawline. No pulse, no warmth. Her body was already deep into rigor mortis, meaning she had been dead for at least 10 hours, possibly more. Lisa turned to her partner, James Miller, who was running a preliminary assessment. Doesn't add up, she muttered under her breath. James nodded. She wasn't moved. No signs of struggle. And look at her throat. Lisa's gaze followed his, and she immediately understood what he meant. There was faint bruising around the front of Shanti's neck, subtle but present. Strangulation bruises often took time to darken, but she had seen them enough to recognize the pattern. Doesn't match a fall, James murmured. Lisa exhaled slowly. She had responded to enough domestic calls to know when something felt off. And this felt off. She pushed herself up, walking toward the bedroom door where Officer Hernandez now stood. He had been listening, waiting. She met his gaze and gave him a slight nod. This isn't an accident, she said. Outside, David paced near the edge of the porch, keeping his hands stuffed in his pockets. His mind was a mess of calculations. He had played this scenario out in his head, had told himself it would be easy. A tragic accident, a grieving husband, a brief investigation before they ruled it as misfortune. But something was wrong. He could feel the shift in the air, the way the officers spoke to him, the way they looked at him. Then movement at the front door caught his eye. Officer Hernandez stepped out, his face carefully neutral, but there was something behind his eyes, something knowing. Mr. Trones, he said, stepping forward, would you mind coming down to the station with us? We just have a few more questions. David's pulse roared in his ears. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The cold, fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed faintly, casting an unnatural glow over the small, sterile interrogation room. The walls were bare except for a standard 2-way mirror, its surface reflecting the nervous figure of David Trones, who sat hunched at the metal table, his fingers pressed tightly together. He had been sitting here for nearly an hour. No phone, no watch, just the heavy silence pressing down on him like a weight. He knew what this was. A routine questioning, that's all. They had to follow protocol. Ask a few questions, confirm his story, then send him home. He repeated that to himself over and over, as if saying it enough times would make it true. But deep inside, the doubt was growing. The moment he stepped into this room, something in the air had changed. A sharp click echoed as the door opened, and Detective Marcus Hale stepped in, a folder tucked under his arm. He wasn't in uniform like the officers from earlier. He wore a gray blazer over a dark blue shirt, his sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the faint outline of a tattoo on his wrist. His demeanor was calm, almost casual, but there was an undeniable weight behind his gaze, like a man who had seen too many lies unravel. David straightened in his chair, trying to appear composed. "Mr. Tronis," Hale said, setting the folder down on the table before taking a seat across from him. "Appreciate you coming in. I just have a few things I'd like to clear up about this morning." David forced a nod. "Of course, I understand." His voice was steady, rehearsed. He needed to stay in control. Hale opened the folder, flipping through a few pages before settling on one. "So you mentioned on the call that you found your wife in bed, unresponsive. You assumed she fell, maybe hit her head." David nodded again. "Yes. I, I, I didn't hear anything last night. I was downstairs working late, then I slept in the guest room. When I went to check on her this morning, she wasn't breathing." Hale hummed thoughtfully, tapping his pen against the folder. "See, that's where things get a little tricky." He glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Because the medical team didn't find any sign of a head injury. In fact, they found no evidence that she fell at all." David's breath caught, but he forced himself to remain still. Maybe, maybe it was something internal, a stroke, a heart attack? He grasped at possibilities, anything to make this go away. Hale leaned forward slightly. "That's what we thought too. But the medical examiner took a closer look. There was bruising around her neck." He let the words sink in before continuing. "Now, that's not something we'd expect from a fall, Mr. Tronis." A cold sweat broke out along David's spine. His mind scrambled for an explanation. He shook his head. I don't understand. I swear. I never touched her." Hale studied him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. Then, with deliberate patience, he pulled a photograph from the folder and slid it across the table. It was a close-up of Shanti's neck. The bruising wasn't immediately obvious, but under the harsh lighting of the coroner's office, faint, distinct marks wrapped around her throat. Hale tapped a finger against the image. "This," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "looks a lot like strangulation." David's stomach twisted violently. His hands clenched beneath the table, but he kept his expression as neutral as possible. There has to be a mistake." Hale leaned back, crossing his arms. "Then help me understand. You were the only person in that house last night. Your wife didn't leave. No one came in. If she didn't fall, and she didn't do this to herself, who did?" David's throat tightened. I don't know. Maybe, maybe someone broke in?" Hale's brow lifted slightly. "A break-in?" He flipped to another page in the folder, scanning the report. "That's interesting, because there were no signs of forced entry. No doors or windows were tampered with, and all the security cameras in the neighborhood show nothing unusual." He closed the folder with a soft thump and steepled his fingers. "So let's go over this again, Mr. Trans. What really happened last night?" David's pulse pounded in his ears. He felt trapped, like an animal backed into a corner. His mind raced, searching for a way out. I told you everything I know," he stammered. "I loved my wife. I would never—" "You loved her?" Hale repeated, tilting his head slightly. "That's interesting, because from what we've gathered, your marriage wasn't exactly thriving." David's jaw tightened. "That's not true." Hale opened the folder again, this time pulling out another sheet of paper. "We've spoken to some of Shanti's friends. They said she was unhappy, that she was considering leaving you." He let the words linger before adding, "and that she was afraid of you." David's chest constricted. His carefully controlled mask cracked, just for a second. Hale caught it. He leaned in slightly, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. "Here's what I think happened, David. The house, this whole project, it meant everything to you. You poured all your money into it, spent months obsessing over every little detail, and then Shanti told you she didn't want to be a part of it. She didn't want to be a part of you anymore." He studied David's face, watching for a reaction. "And you couldn't handle that, could you?" David's breath came quicker now, his hands gripping his knees under the table. "That's not what happened." Hale didn't look away. "Then tell me what did." The silence that followed was suffocating. David's mind raced. He knew what they were doing. They were setting a trap, waiting for him to trip over his own lies. He had to stay calm. He had to stick to his story. But even as he told himself that, he felt the walls closing in. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold them off. The walls of the interrogation room felt like they were closing in, inch by inch, as David Tronas struggled to maintain his composure. The temperature hadn't changed, but sweat beaded along his hairline, a thin layer of moisture forming on the back of his neck. He clenched his hands beneath the table, his fingers pressing against the rough fabric of his jeans, grounding himself. Stay calm. Stay in control. That was what he had told himself from the moment the police showed up at his house. But now, as Detective Marcus Hale sat across from him, watching him like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike, David felt his confidence slipping away. "Let's go over your timeline again," Hale said, his voice deceptively casual. He flipped through his notes, glancing at them as though he were merely tying up loose ends. "You said you went to bed around midnight, right?" David nodded quickly. "Yes, I was working downstairs on some renovation plans. Lost track of time. When I finally went up, I didn't check on Shanti. I just went straight to the guest room." Hale nodded, tapping his pen against the folder in front of him. "Right. And this morning, you found her unresponsive in bed." "Yes," David said, voice tight. "Did you touch her?" David hesitated, his mind racing. "Was this a trap?" "Yes," he said finally, trying to sound convincing. "I tried shaking her awake. When she didn't respond, I panicked and called 911. Hale watched him for a moment before slowly flipping over a new piece of evidence. A forensic report. The paper made a soft thwop against the metal table, but to David, it sounded like a gunshot. "You see, here's the problem, David," Hale continued, his tone still unsettlingly calm. "Shanti had been dead for hours before you made that call. Rigor mortis had fully set in. Her body was already stiff. So when you say you shook her awake, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it?" David's stomach dropped. He could feel his pulse in his throat, his heartbeat drumming against his ribcage. I didn't know," he stammered. "I was in shock." Hale leaned back in his chair, as if giving him space to hang himself further. "That's interesting," he mused, "because the paramedics said you didn't seem shocked at all. Concerned, sure. Maybe a little dazed. But real grief? Panic? Not so much." David's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. "People react differently to trauma," he argued, his voice rising just slightly. "You can't judge how I processed finding my wife like that." Hale tilted his head. "That's true," he admitted. "But you know what is objective? Forensics." Another page flipped, another document, another trap. "We did a preliminary sweep of the house," Hale said, tapping his finger against the page. "Nothing too invasive yet, just standard procedure. And guess what we found?" He let the silence stretch before answering his own question. "No blood, no signs of a struggle, no head trauma. But we did find something interesting in the laundry room." David's breath hitched. "A towel with small traces of blood. And when we ran the DNA," Hale's lips curled into a smile, but there was nothing warm about it. "It was Shanti's." David's mouth went dry. "I don't know how that got there," he said quickly, shaking his head. "She could have had a nosebleed, cut herself, anything." Hale didn't react. He simply flipped to another page. "And then there's the matter of the security footage." David's mind blanked. "Footage?" Hale continued. "Now, your house doesn't have cameras installed, but some of your neighbors? They do, and one of them has a camera that catches a pretty good angle of your front door." He let the words settle before dropping the bombshell. "And around 2:30 a.m., guess who we saw outside?" David's throat tightened. He couldn't speak. "You," Hale answered for him. "Walking back inside, which means you were awake, which means your timeline completely falls apart." David's head spun. His carefully constructed story was crumbling, piece by piece, and no matter how desperately he tried to keep it together, the cracks were too deep. "Think. Think. Think. I went outside for air," he blurted out. "I couldn't sleep." Hale raised a skeptical brow. "At 2:30 in the morning?" "Yes," David insisted. I was stressed. The renovations, the money, the show. Everything's been overwhelming. I just needed a minute to clear my head. Hale leaned forward again, his voice dropping slightly. Did you need a minute before or after your wife was already dead? David's skin went ice cold. I didn't, because right now, Hale continued, cutting him off. None of this looks good for you. Your story has holes. The forensics don't match. The timeline doesn't match. And the only person who could tell us what really happened, he gestured vaguely, his meaning clear. Well, she can't. David swallowed hard, the reality of his situation pressing down on him like a vice. This was spiraling out of control. They didn't have proof, but they were getting close. Too close. He forced himself to take a slow breath, searching for some way, any way, to regain control. I think I need a lawyer, he muttered. Hale smiled, but it wasn't friendly. That's probably the first smart thing you've said all day. David Tron sat in the cold, windowless holding room, his hands clasped together, fingers digging into the skin of his knuckles. The fluorescent light buzzed above him, casting sharp shadows on the sterile walls. The air smelled of disinfectant and something else, something metallic, like the scent of tension and fear. He had asked for a lawyer, and now he was left to sit in silence, waiting, thinking, calculating. He had replayed his statement in his head at least a dozen times, looking for weak spots, for anything he had said that might give them leverage. The police had theories, but no solid proof. That was the key. No proof meant no conviction. When the door creaked open, David straightened instinctively. His lawyer, Robert Easton, entered the room, his dark suit pristine, his demeanor as controlled as ever. He dropped a leather briefcase onto the table, taking his time as he settled into the chair across from him. You really put yourself in a corner, Easton said without preamble. His tone was measured, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. David wet his lips. They don't have anything, he said quickly. It's all speculation. My story holds. Easton lifted a brow but said nothing. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a folder and flipping through it with careful precision. David's pulse quickened as he watched, waiting, wondering what was inside. They have enough to arrest you, Easton finally said. Not to convict you yet, but they're building a case, piece by piece, and the longer you sit here, the worse it's going to get. David's fingers twitched. What exactly do they have? Easton exhaled, glancing down at the papers before speaking. The autopsy report came in. Official cause of death. Manual strangulation. No signs of a fall. No blunt force trauma. And the medical examiner says she fought back. He let the words settle before adding, which means they're looking for defensive wounds. And if they find anything that matches you, David's jaw locked. He knew where this was going. Her nails, Easton continued, his voice level. They found fibers under them. You understand what that means, don't you? David swallowed hard. If they run the DNA and it matches you, Easton said, you're done. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in on him. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. She could have scratched me earlier in the day, he tried. People touch each other all the time. Easton didn't look impressed. They'll know if it was fresh, and if it was, that means she fought for her life. David leaned forward, lowering his voice. So what do we do? Easton watched him carefully. We wait. Until they come back with charges, you say nothing. No sudden moves, no outbursts. You let me handle it. David nodded stiffly, but deep down, he felt it. The creeping, gnawing realization that this was spiraling out of his control. The door opened again, and detectives Marcus Hale and Laura Bennett entered. They moved with quiet confidence, their eyes sharp, their expressions unreadable. Hale set a folder on the table and took a seat, folding his hands in front of him. Bennett remained standing, arms crossed. Mr. Trons, Hale said, his tone polite but firm. Thanks for your patience. We have a few more things to discuss. Easton leaned back. My client won't be answering any questions at this time. Hale nodded, as if he had expected that. That's fine. We just wanted to share a few updates. He opened the folder, flipping to a page and sliding it across the table. This is the official autopsy report. It confirms what we already suspected. Shanti didn't fall. She didn't suffer any kind of accidental injury. She was strangled to death. He paused, giving David a long look. Would you like to revise your statement? David clenched his jaw. He knew this game. Stay quiet. Stay in control. When he didn't respond, Hale continued. There's more. We have a witness now. David's heart lurched. A witness? Your neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, Bennett said, stepping closer. She remembers hearing an argument late that night. She heard Shanti say, I can't do this anymore. I want out. She tilted her head slightly. That doesn't exactly sound like a happy marriage, does it? David gritted his teeth. Arguments happen in every relationship. Hale smirked. Sure, but not every argument ends in someone dead. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Bennett crossed her arms. Mrs. Calloway also remembers something else. After the shouting stopped, she heard running water. A lot of it, like someone was cleaning up. David's skin went ice cold. Hale leaned forward, his voice quieter now. What were you washing at 2 in the morning, David? David forced himself to stay still, to keep his breathing even. I don't remember. Hale's gaze sharpened. Try harder. The silence that followed was unbearable. David's throat felt like sandpaper, his chest tight with the weight of everything crashing down around him. They weren't just building a case. They already had one. They were just waiting for the final piece. Then, as if reading his mind, Hale reached into his folder one last time and pulled out a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a small piece of fabric. David's stomach flipped. Hale placed it on the table, tapping a finger against the plastic. This was found in the laundry room stained with blood. And guess what? Lab results say it's Shanti's blood. He tilted his head. So tell me, David, how did your wife's blood end up on a towel that you tried to get rid of? David's mind went blank. They had him. He felt Easton shift beside him, his lawyer's presence suddenly distant, almost unimportant. Hale leaned in, lowering his voice to a near whisper. You can feel it, can't you? The walls closing in? David's hands trembled under the table. He needed to get out of here. He needed air. He needed time. But time had run out. David Trans had always believed himself to be a man in control. Every detail of his life had been meticulously crafted, each move calculated with precision. But now, as he sat in the interrogation room, feeling the weight of the evidence pressing down on him like a slow, suffocating tide, he realized control was an illusion. The air in the room felt heavier than before, thick with unspoken truths, with the unrelenting presence of the detectives who had spent the last few days meticulously dismantling his carefully constructed story. His lawyer, Robert Easton, sat beside him, unreadable as ever, but David could feel the shift in energy. There had been a time, maybe just hours ago, when Easton had believed he could get his client out of this. That confidence had eroded, replaced by something colder, more detached. A lawyer could only do so much when the truth was closing in from every direction. The folder that Detective Marcus Hale had placed on the table remained unopened for an agonizingly long moment. It sat there, thick and full of the answers David didn't want to hear. The weight of it was unbearable, heavier than anything else in the room. When Hale finally flipped it open, the sound of paper brushing against paper felt deafening. Inside was the forensic report, the final piece. Hale didn't rush as he read over the top page, his brow furrowing slightly as if he were seeing the results for the first time. But David knew better. The detective had already absorbed every word, had already made his conclusions. He was only drawing this out for effect. And then, it came. The moment David had been dreading. The DNA results are back, Hale said, his voice even, almost bored. The fibers found under Shanti's fingernails? He paused for a fraction of a second, letting the anticipation build. Are a match to you. David's stomach twisted violently, and for a brief, horrifying moment, he thought he might be sick. His hands tightened into fists beneath the table, nails digging into his palms, anything to ground himself. This couldn't be happening. Hale kept going, relentless. You see, when someone is strangled, their body fights back instinctively. Even if they don't have the strength to overpower their attacker, their hands reach for anything. Clothes, hair, skin. And in this case, Shanti fought until her last breath. The fibers under her nails aren't just from your shirt, David. They're from your skin. The words hit him like a physical blow. He had always told himself that if it came to this, if the police ever had real evidence, he would find a way out. A loophole, a reasonable doubt. But this? There was no escaping this. His mind raced through the possibilities. Could the evidence have been planted? Could there be some kind of mistake in the analysis? But he knew better. The truth was inescapable. He had killed her, and now the whole world would know it. Detective Laura Bennett, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward slightly, flipping another page in the folder. "There's something else," she said, her voice almost gentle. "We ran a second set of tests. Shanti had a cut on her lip, likely from the struggle. We swabbed it. Guess whose DNA we found there?" David's skin went cold. Hale gave him a knowing look. "Yours." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the distant hum of voices from outside the door. Time felt frozen, stretched into something unbearable. David tried to swallow, but his throat was dry, his pulse hammering in his ears. This was it, the moment where everything crumbled. For the first time since this nightmare began, he allowed himself to consider something he had refused to before. What if there was no way out? The evidence was insurmountable. The timeline didn't match his alibi. The forensic analysis placed him at the scene in a way that couldn't be explained away. Shanti had fought back, had clawed at him in her final moments, leaving behind proof that he couldn't erase, no matter how much he had tried to control the situation. His lawyer shifted beside him, exhaling slowly. "I think we need a moment," Easton finally said, his voice level but firm. Hale nodded, standing up with deliberate slowness. "Take all the time you need, Watt," he said, though his tone suggested he already knew how this would end. As the door shut behind the detectives, David felt something he hadn't let himself feel before. Panic. Real, undeniable panic. His entire body was tense, his muscles locked, as if he could physically hold back the inevitable. But there was no stopping it. Easton turned to him, his expression still composed, but there was a new hardness in his eyes. "We don't have many options left," he said. "They're going to charge you. The only thing we can do now is try to negotiate what comes next." David barely heard him. His thoughts were racing, spiraling. Jail, a trial, the media, the world knowing what he had done. He had thought he could get away with it, had convinced himself that he was smarter than all of them. But he had underestimated everything. The science, the scrutiny, the determination of those who sought justice for Shanti. And now he was trapped. There were no more lies to tell, no more alibis to construct, no more clever manipulations to escape the truth. For the first time since Shanti had taken her last breath, David understood something with absolute, terrifying clarity. He was going to spend the rest of his life paying for what he had done, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The moment the cold steel of the handcuffs locked around David Tront's wrists, he felt a sharp, visceral jolt, a shift from delusion to reality, from denial to consequence. The pressure of metal biting into his skin was nothing compared to the crushing weight in his chest, the slow and terrifying realization that he had finally lost control. He had been escorted out of the police station in silence, flanked by officers on either side. The once familiar streets of Orlando now foreign through the tinted windows of the patrol car. This city, which he had imagined would one day celebrate him as a man of vision, as a genius renovator, as someone worthy of recognition, was now witnessing his downfall. As the car rolled to a stop outside the Orange County Jail, the flashing lights from news cameras painted the night in flickering shades of blue and red. Reporters swarmed the entrance like vultures, their voices blending into a chaotic hum of shouted questions and snapping cameras. "David, did you kill your wife? Why did you strangle Shanti? Was this planned or a crime of passion?" The questions were relentless, each one laced with venom, with certainty. They didn't see a man they were questioning. They saw a murderer. He kept his head down as officers led him inside, past the chaos, past the whispers, past the world he had once lived in. The booking process was clinical, devoid of any sympathy. Mugshot, fingerprints. the exchange of his expensive tailored clothes for an orange jumpsuit that stripped him of all identity, all illusion of superiority. He was processed like every other criminal who had walked through these halls, each step another nail in the coffin of the life he once knew. His first night in jail was an endless stretch of hours marked by the flickering light above his cot, the distant echoes of shouting from other inmates, and the suffocating knowledge that this was no longer temporary. This was his life now, the trial of David Tronis. The state of Florida became a national sensation, fueled by the gruesome details of the case, the forensic evidence, and the chilling portrait of a man who had let his obsession consume him. News outlets labeled him everything from a calculating sociopath to a desperate failing husband who snapped in a moment of rage. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney Rachel Calloway, built their case methodically, presenting not only the physical evidence, but the psychological pattern that had led to Shanti's murder. The motive was as clear as the bruises around her throat. David had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on their home renovation, draining their finances into a crumbling structure that remained perpetually unfinished. His obsession with transforming the house into a grand spectacle had left Shanti isolated, unheard, and financially tied to a man she no longer trusted. She had confided in friends, sent emails, made plans. She was going to leave, and David had known it. The night of the murder, the prosecution argued, Shanti had told David she was done, that she was walking away from the house, from the show, from him. That simple declaration had shattered the fragile illusion David had spent years building. She wasn't supposed to leave. She was supposed to support him, to believe in his dream, to stand beside him on television, smiling while cameras captured his success. But she refused. And in that moment, David made a choice. He grabbed her, held her down, and strangled her. He didn't stop when she struggled. He didn't stop when she clawed at his arms, when her nails dug into his skin. He didn't stop until the fight left her body, until her breath faded into silence. Then, in a methodical haze, he cleaned the evidence, changed his clothes, and waited for the morning to come. He had rehearsed his call to 911, planned his words, convinced himself that it would be enough, that he could explain this away. But forensics never lie. The trial lasted 6 weeks, each day another damning revelation, another piece of evidence that further solidified the prosecution's case. The forensic scientists detailed how Shanti had not died quickly, how the pressure around her throat had been sustained, methodical, deliberate, a crime of control, not of passion. The neighbor's testimony confirmed the timeline. The argument, the sudden silence, the sound of running water in the middle of the night. It all fit perfectly into place. David's defense, on the other hand, was weak, full of excuses and contradictions. His lawyer attempted to claim that Shanti had a pre-existing medical condition, that she could have collapsed, that David had panicked and mistakenly assumed she was sleeping. But the autopsy report obliterated that argument. There was no natural cause of death, no possibility of an accident. And then came the final nail in the coffin, the DNA analysis. The prosecution played it out in slow, excruciating detail. The fibers beneath Shanti's nails, the traces of David's skin, the blood-stained towel he had tried to dispose of. Each piece of evidence layered on top of the next, forming an unshakable foundation of guilt. And David knew it was over. When he took the stand in his own defense, his once confident demeanor had withered. The man who had meticulously curated his own image for years, who had controlled every narrative about his life, now faced a truth he couldn't manipulate. His voice cracked under cross-examination, his answers hesitant, his attempts at justifications laughable in the face of the facts. He wasn't a grieving husband. He wasn't a man suffering from a tragic accident. He was a murderer, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. It took the jury just under 3 hours to reach a verdict. As they filed back into the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. David sat stiffly at the defense table, his hands trembling beneath the surface. The weight of the past 6 weeks had crushed him. But this moment of waiting for judgment was more agonizing than any night he had spent in his cell. When the judge turned to the jury foreman and asked for the verdict, the words came swift and clear. We, the jury, Find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. A sharp gasp rippled through the courtroom. Shanti's family wept, some holding on to each other, others closing their eyes in silent relief. David, for the first time, showed real emotion. His breath hitched, his face pale, his carefully crafted mask finally crumbling. The judge's voice carried no sympathy, no hesitation as he delivered the sentence. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. David Trones had spent his life obsessed with creating a perfect home, a perfect image, a perfect reality. And now the only home he would ever know was a prison cell. The only reality left to him, one of permanent isolation. There was no escaping this. There was no second chance. Only the cold, irrevocable truth of what he had done. And as the courtroom emptied, leaving him alone in the defendant's chair, David finally understood what it felt like to be trapped inside his own creation. The prison walls were not much different from the house David Tron had spent years obsessing over. Cold, unfinished, a monument to failure. The difference was, in this house would never be completed. There would be no renovations, no grand reveal, no cameras rolling to capture the final product. It was not a home, just a structure meant to contain him, to strip him of what little control he had left. Inside, time lost all meaning. The days stretched into weeks, into months, each one identical to the last. The cold, artificial lights flickered the same way every morning. The steel bars hummed as the guards walked by at regular intervals. The food was tasteless, the noise relentless, a distant, never-ending cacophony of shouting, metal clanging, and the occasional burst of violence from unseen corners. He was no longer a man with a vision. He was an inmate, a number in a system that had already forgotten who he used to be. He had tried in the beginning to convince himself that an appeal would save him. His lawyer had filed the paperwork, had fought on technicalities, but the truth was, there was no loophole to exploit. The evidence was overwhelming, the jury's decision unanimous. There would be no reduced sentence, no second chance. This was his life now. Occasionally he would receive letters. Most were from people he didn't know. Strangers who wrote to tell him exactly what they thought of him. Murderer, coward, monster. The words were scrawled in ink, sometimes in jagged, angry script, sometimes in neat, measured handwriting, as if that somehow made the message more civilized. He never wrote back. Then there were the letters from Shanti's family. He had received only a few, but they cut deeper than any courtroom sentence ever could. One from her mother had been the worst. I don't know if you even feel guilt. I don't know if you're capable of it. But if there is any part of you that understands what you've done, then you know this. You didn't just kill my daughter. You killed every future she had left. You killed every moment she was supposed to have. Every smile, every laugh, every morning she should have woken up safe and happy. And for what? A house? A fantasy? Your pride? I hope you think about that every day, for the rest of your life, because we will. We don't get to escape this, and neither should you. He had torn that letter into pieces, but the words never left him. He rarely spoke to other inmates. He had no real allies in prison, no one to confide in. Most of them had nothing but contempt for men who killed their wives. He had learned quickly to keep his head down, to avoid conversations, to stay out of the way. But it didn't matter. They still knew. How's that dream house coming along, Tron? You ever see her in your sleep? Bet you wish she was still around to keep you company now, huh? The words didn't need to be shouted, even whispered. They cut like blades. Outside the walls of the prison, life moved on. The house on Delaney Avenue stood abandoned for months before the bank finally seized it. No one wanted it. Not to live in, not to renovate, not even to tear down. Too much history, too much death. The real estate listing was bleak, stripped of the grandeur David had once envisioned for it. There were no excited buyers, no television crews, no dreamers looking to bring it back to life. Eventually, a local developer bought the land, bulldozing what remained of David's failed vision. A new home was built in its place, modern, simple, unburdened by the past. But the neighbors never forgot. Some still whispered about that night, about the screams that had stopped too suddenly, about the water running in the early hours of the morning. about the cameras that had captured David walking outside, alone in the dark, long before he ever called for help. And sometimes late at night, when the street was quiet, people swore they could still hear something in the wind, a lingering echo of the past, a voice that had been silenced too soon. Shanti's family had not forgiven, but they had moved forward. Her mother became active in organizations for victims of domestic violence, speaking at events, sharing her daughter's story. Not as a tragedy, but as a warning. She refused to let Shanti's name be reduced to a headline, to a case number, to a story that people discussed and then forgot. Her friends still gathered on the anniversary of her death, lighting candles, sharing memories. They talked about her kindness, her intelligence, her laughter. They refused to let her be remembered as just the woman who was murdered. She was so much more than that. David Tronis had spent his life chasing perfection, obsessed with an image of success that had never been real. He had convinced himself that he was building something that mattered, that his vision would make him somebody. In the end, he had built nothing. The house was gone. His freedom was gone. Shanti was gone. And he would never leave this place. For the rest of his life, he would wake up in the same gray cell, staring at the same cinder block walls, knowing that the only thing he had truly created was his own prison. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.